Hello and welcome to our three-part discussion on artificial intelligence and technology, where we are exploring some of the issues that affect individuals, executives, corporate leaders, companies, and how they operate, and how society itself is likely to change. I'm Paul Lewis, I'm the editorial director of Headspring, and to discuss some of these very big issues, I'm joined by Mark Esposito, who is a leading thinker, writer, and teacher on artificial intelligence, and also an entrepreneur, and who I'm very proud to say is one of Headspring's faculty members. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Paul.
I want to talk about some of the wider societal issues of technology and in particular artificial intelligence, and the responses of individuals and companies to that. I think it can be very frightening for some people, certainly for a certain generation, but even those digital natives may not be native for very long as technology shifts. So I think it's something that affects all generations. And I can sort of imagine three responses of people. The first one is, listen, opt out. I don't want to be tracked. I don't want to be traced. I don't want every single thing I do, buy, think, express, every friendship, every place I go to be tracked. And I don't want any of this. I want to cut out. And I guess the question on that is it actually possible to cut out? Is there some way where you can reduce your exposure to an artificially intelligence-driven world? The second one, which I think many people in the corporate world are involved in, which is, look, we need a partnership with AI. We need to find a balance where the essential things that make us human and improve our lives aren't getting taken out and taken in a direction we don't want to go. But actually, if we get that balance right, we're all so much better off. And then the third option is sort of almost to give in, to say, look, you know, I'm happy to take all the benefits. It means giving up all sense of autonomy. But actually, I'm not even thinking about it. Yes, I'll probably lose a lot of the skills I have, but I don't have the will to resist, and I'll just go along with it and we'll see what happens. Can you give us a sense of how those three options, how people might respond, might actually play out? Starting with the idea that people can opt out. Is it possible, and to what extent?
So, Paul, it's possible if we go in regions of the world where the technology is not so pervasive as it is elsewhere. You know, when we are in location where our mobile phones are constantly being tracked, when we're using our credit cards to make payments or withdrawals at the ATM, when we are using our internet access to send emails or to facilitate any form of digital transaction, we kind of part of that. So it becomes difficult to imagine that we could be entirely excluded from that world. I mean, we could. I think there are parts of the world where digital transformation is not happening as fast as we can imagine. And there are parts of the world where maybe it all resorts down to a mobile phone, nothing more. I think there's a side of the story, I think, that can go in that direction. I don't know whether it's actually possible to get to the extent in which you're entirely detoxing from technology at that level. I think technology today is much more of an omnipresence than what we can imagine. So I'm skeptical about the possibility that we could then be entirely immune to this. The other two options you present on the table, the partnership and the giving in. I mean, I'm hoping we're not giving in because giving in means that we're also giving in to the manipulation that comes with technology. And I think we would be unfair for me not to represent the fact that in the same way as I can be manipulated by reading a menu in a restaurant, by deciding that I want to have chicken versus fish just because of the font or how big it is written, right? I would like people to understand that technology can easily hack some of our behaviors, because I think it's within the range of what technology tries to do is to generate engagement, to push us to maybe do something that seems to be cool or has some form of social normative aspect. So I would imagine the second option, the partnership, is really where I would like more thinking to go. And I guess the question is not shall we partner, is how will we partner with technology? I guess it goes into the governance of technology in the same way as we're governing what we eat and the kind of pharmas we're using when we go into the doctor. There's nothing wrong in having a prescription to go to the pharmacy for something you can't get yourself off the shelf. Like there is nothing wrong with me requiring a food license if I want to have a food truck because I can't simply sell food. So the boundary that we have in some of the industries are equally necessary in technologies because it's normal that in a society with conventional norms, we create boundaries. Whether we generate those boundaries, whether we are able to govern them, whether we are understanding privacy, whether we are understanding that where is the line between technology and my own determination or arbitrary, I think this is really where the conversation should go. I'm happy you brought this up as a philosophical conversation because it's really about the narrative we will develop about the role of technology in our life. Most of our inherited systems did not have this technology when they were designed. So it's not the 20th century legacy of ideas that will help us with the kind of challenge we're having right now. So I'm hoping that the second option is the one where we're going to spend most of the time. And the other two options, they are naturally extreme. One is one that I see hard to achieve. The other one is one I'm very afraid because then the moment that you are creating blurred boundary between yourself and technologies, which would be the option of giving in and letting technology run your life, it's kind of difficult to imagine asking the question, what's our identity? What defines being human other than maybe an Instagram post, right? That would be a dangerous dangerous scenario to eventually see unfold in front of our life.
Yeah. I guess one of the concerns is that the technology doesn't just exist in a sort of neutral way and it's for us to use it. I think the problem lies if there's an agenda, there is a lot of money to be made, and therefore, it's not something we can just tap and make use of. On the other side of the equation, there are obviously interests in getting as many people sort of plugged into it, as you mentioned before in our previous conversation about the sort of the metaverse. There's an urgency, there's a pressure to take part in it. I think you mentioned COVID as well and how that was transformative. Mm-hmm. I guess the different countries' responses to COVID in terms of lockdowns, in terms of track and trace, we all had slightly different ways of dealing with it. But there would be a situation where there's this debate about the collective good versus the individual rights. I don't want to get into that conversation itself, but AI and technology changes the nature of that, because if you're being tracked, it's very hard to assert an individual right. If, on the other hand, people are saying, well, this is a collective good, and therefore you've got no right to assert that individual right because it's selfish or whatever. And I think AI is very much at the heart of that. We're all better off, even though some people may not be better off. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter because you're the minority here.
Yeah. Paul, where I think the conundrum is most of the company they are tracing or tracking us are private companies. Even if they end up serving a public office or a government, difference between physical asset and data is that if I have a barrel of oil and I burn it, it doesn't exist anymore. But if I give you the data, I still have a copy of that, right? So where do we actually define the relationship between private company they are designed to increase their revenues as by their foundation to the collective good? And that's where I think the governance is required for us to start understanding how do we make sure that information are becoming precious and valuable in a way they are protected without feeling that this is becoming an innovation graveyards, which is one of the arguments some governments push forward. So I would say the size of the AI players in the world is unfortunately in the hands of very few companies. We have fundamentally two kinds. The matrices are two. One is the American companies where you have the Facebook, the Amazon, the Apple, the Netflix, the Google, the Microsoft. And then you have in the Chinese companies where you have in Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. The American company are private company, the Chinese company are state-owned companies. You kind of see where the challenge is right now, right? And so maybe a way for this to become a better conversation is that we generate the portability of technology to more and more country and regions where we can have this technology prospering and propelling from the ground up. Less dependency on a few, let's say, fortresses, and more of a grassroots movements. I think decentralization in this case is required for the tension between public and private not to be so daunting as it is right now. I think what defines currently the challenge we have is the magnitude and size of the private companies against the magnitude and size of the governments. You could argue that a government could actually be blackmailed by a technology company. And I think it happened with Australia and Google, where Google suddenly started to be a bit more strict with this tone and saying, well, let's change the economic condition for you to use Google in your country. And then suddenly that generates a major impact because we don't really have an alternative to Google these days, right? And that's by itself a challenge on its own. So I would say there are challenges, but they're equally structural problem that we need to look at, which is this dependency on the private sector and very few companies is something that we should see eventually alleviated of some form, which doesn't mean breaking Google into smaller Googles, but making it possible for more companies to have access to technologies that we can use that will probably decrease the tension we have in between public and private.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering whether or not you feel that the political structures, the nation state, more or less, is the, let's say, the correct or the effective unit of sort of democratic representation or power. When you have industrial revolutions, the social and political organizations change around it. I mean, even this globalization era, we've seen how, companies need instant global supply chains and recruitment and global markets. And obviously, we see countries creating trade zones and so on, and less inward-looking nationalism because it doesn't serve, the economic development. I'm just wondering whether we are looking at another sort of restructuring of a global system in order for these globalized artificial intelligence and tech companies to be able to function effectively. You mentioned the sort of the difference in size and power and money and ambition. Are the political arrangements we have at the moment, or have had over the last sort of 40, 50 years, are they fit for purpose?
Paul, that's a very good point. Nation states served the purpose in the 19th and 20th century in imperialistic terms, but not necessarily in the 21st century, when most of the value is decentralized already. Cities are much more of an interesting story than countries or federal governments. And I think the best ways for me to share this are like if inside of the large technology company, the concept of ecosystem matters, because you want to have an ecosystem that is enriched by many players. In terms of the country or government level, having these functional geographies on the territory rather than a centralization at the government level, I think is much better as a story. So we talk about ecosystem when we talk about digital and technology. We should talk about functional geography when we talk about governments, because the epicenter of power has changed. The accumulation of the amassing of economic power in cities is much larger than in countries. I mean, let's take an example like London, we mentioned in another episode. London is roughly 37% of the UK GDP. It's an incredible superpower within a city, right? And that's why London has its own narrative to some extent, right? And so you can argue the same for many other parts of the world. So clearly we are in the presence of a transformation of our, I would say, distribution of value. Unfortunately, which is actually one of the challenges we see, we still measure country at the national level. We talk about G7 or G20, when some cities might be more prominent than some of the country represented into this, let's say, this display of power. So clearly, if we are changing the technology scene, we equally should understanding that from a government perspective, the balance of powers have changed as well.
And where do companies, not necessarily tech companies, but where do ordinary companies fit in this new ecosystem? What is their role if they're connected up to a sort of blockchain style ecosystem that's much vaster than anything they've had before, and where decisions, there's an uneasy relationship with decision making. Is there a social responsibility for companies to sort of almost protect the employees within, to keep them sort of whole, to maintain their sort of authenticity? Almost a throwback to the sort of paternalist idea from the sort of maybe the 1920s or even 19th century, where the employer looked after its employees, and that when you work for a company, they sort of protect your sort of human integrity. Is that where the role of the company is, rather than this sort of relentless sense of, well, it's the bottom line, or even stakeholders, but it's sort of the protective nature of it? Do you see anything happening there?
Yeah. So, interesting you asking this, Paul, because, we've been having a conversation about the B Corp. We having conversation about organizations that they are for purpose. Roughly 10% of the companies in the world, they define themselves for purpose rather than for profit, right? And it's interesting because profit is not against purpose. It's just the way you are mainly rewarding the system to be able to be fluid. But the essence of an organization should not be just to generate purpose. I mean, most companies back in the days, they were becoming company because you are trying to meet an important need with a business model. So I see like a rewiring of the conversation in the right direction. I think probably powered also by a generation like the millennials. They have taken purpose at the next level of what we could have done back in the days. I think that going back to the conversation on technology, if we are infusing technology into the small, medium enterprises, if we make it possible for them to scale, to have access to financing, to make sure that they can go into global markets, then we're really going to protect more and more of those innovators, those companies, employees who are working in what I consider to be the backbone of the economy. An economy cannot be run entirely by multinational companies. It has to be run by, the small company that are on the territory. We know this because most of the country that have a strong backbone in small, medium enterprises are rich countries. If you take the example of the 54 countries in Africa, what you notice they don't have is a small, medium enterprise culture. They have 50% of their value multinational company, many of these extracting value, and most of it is informal economy. So I think we have to rethink the purpose of organization without having this necessity of feeling that the only way for us to have significance is in these large companies. And I'm hoping that, again, I'm always thinking technology, can technology help? There was an interesting project from Capgemini that I was part in 2020 about the portability of technology. And the idea is, if you decentralize technology and you make it available to more, you're empowering the small, medium enterprises to be part of the picture, rather than them being acquired or eventually, eradicated from the market itself. So I am a proponent that a healthy society where you have in the multinational company, they are propellers, but the small, medium enterprises, they really are consolidating on the ground. That's where the story really happened, I think. And if we use technology as a way of equalizing, I think we can do that. But I equally want to say this, because considering the conversation we're having, Paul, I've been a proponent of the fourth industrial revolution as a concept because I see the convergence of what technology can do, because I believe that technology can become an equalizer. But the absence of this, so the opposite is equally true. If we don't manage this correctly, technology will become the largest disequalizer we had in history. And we have to be very careful to make sure that we're not taking it for granted, that we are collectively working for a redistribution of power in the right way, technology being part of the solution, because that is really where I think the 21st century could go in terms of the potentials. And again, I am a techno optimist myself, but I like to believe that technology can really address some of our challenges if the collective design of technology is not just neutral, but is actually very advanced towards the idea of enhancing society in general.
Mark, thank you so much. Your optimism certainly comes through. And yes, handling it well and sensibly, possibly a very bright future. We've discussed some very, very big issues, big philosophical issues, as well as big political, social issues. But what's so striking is that they're all very relevant to our everyday corporate lives and our working lives. It's extraordinary. We can't get away from these philosophical issues, but I think you've expounded extremely well and informatively on this. And I think it's been a great pleasure talking to you. And we'll speak again in the near future.
Thank you, Paul.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.